What happens when a 70-year-old retired detective stumbles upon a case so bizarre that it makes his 30-year career look like child's play? I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about retirement, small towns, and the mysteries that hide in plain sight. My name is Detective Frank Morrison, and after 3 decades of chasing killers, drug dealers, and con artists through the gritty streets of Detroit, I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The case that would become my greatest challenge didn't come to me in some dark alley or precinct interrogation room. It came to me in the most unlikely place imaginable, the quiet, sleepy town of Millbrook, Michigan, where I'd moved to spend my golden years fishing and forgetting about the horrors I'd witnessed. But here's the thing about being a detective. Whoa. You never really retire. The instincts, the curiosity, the burning need to uncover truth, they don't just disappear when you turn in your badge. And thank God for that, because what I discovered in Millbrook would shake this community to its core and remind me why I became a cop in the first place. It started on a Tuesday morning in October 2019. I remember it clearly because the maple leaves were just starting to turn, painting the town in those brilliant reds and golds that make you forget about the darkness that can lurk beneath beauty. I was sitting on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the world wake up, when Mrs. Henderson from across the street came running over, her face pale as winter snow. "Frank," she gasped, barely able to catch her breath. "Something's wrong at the Blackwood house. Terribly wrong." Now, the Blackwood house had been empty for nearly 15 years. Old Victorian mansion, built in 1892, sitting on about 3 acres at the end of Elm Street. The kind of place the kids dare each other to approach on Halloween, you know. But Mrs. Henderson was pointing at something I couldn't ignore. Smoke. Not the cozy chimney smoke of an occupied home, but thick black smoke billowing from the 3rd-floor windows. My first instinct was to call the fire department, which I did. But my second instinct, the one that had kept me alive for 30 years, told me to get closer. As I approached the house, something felt off. The smoke was too controlled, too localized. And there was something else. Cars. 3 of them, parked behind the house where they couldn't be seen from the street. Expensive cars, a Mercedes, a BMW, and a Lexus. Not exactly the vehicles you'd expect to find at an abandoned house in a town where the average income was barely above the poverty line. The fire department arrived within minutes, but by then, the smoke had stopped. Just like that. Gone. The fire chief, a good man named Tom Bradley, who I'd gotten to know at the local diner, looked as confused as I felt. We approached the house together, and what we found inside changed everything. The first floor was exactly what you'd expect from a house that had been empty for 15 years. Dust, cobwebs, scattered furniture covered in sheets. But the second floor, that's where things got interesting. Clean, spotless, recently used, and not just recently used, but recently lived in. There were fresh groceries in what had once been the kitchen, modern electronics, and most disturbing of all, surveillance equipment. Professional-grade cameras, monitors, recording devices. Someone had been watching this town very, very carefully, but it was the 3rd floor that made my blood run cold. What we found there wasn't just evidence of occupancy. It was evidence of planning. Detailed maps of Millbrook, photographs of residents going about their daily routines, and most chilling of all, a wall covered with newspaper clippings, missing persons reports, dozens of them, from towns all across the Midwest, small towns, towns just like Millbrook. I knew I was in over my head, but I also knew I was the only one in this town with the experience to handle what was clearly a federal case. I called my old partner, Detective Sarah Chen, who'd risen through the ranks to become a liaison with the FBI. Within hours, she was on a plane to Michigan, and by the next morning, we had a full task force assembled. What we uncovered over the next 3 weeks was a conspiracy that reached far beyond anything I'd encountered in my career. The Blackwood house wasn't just a hideout of woe. It was a command center. We were dealing with a sophisticated human trafficking ring that had been operating across rural America for over a decade. They'd perfected a system of targeting small towns, studying the residents, identifying the most vulnerable, and then making them disappear in ways that looked like voluntary departures. The genius of their operation was its invisibility. They'd choose people who wouldn't be immediately missed au woots. Elderly folks with no family, young adults struggling with addiction, anyone who might have reason to just pick up and leave. They'd study these people for months, learning their habits, their routines, their connections to the community. Then, when the time was right, they'd make their move. But here's where the story takes a turn that still gives me chills. As we dug deeper into the surveillance footage they'd collected, we realized they hadn't just been watching random residents. They'd been watching specific people who matched a very particular profile. And I was one of them. Retired law enforcement officers. People with investigative experience who might be likely to notice things others would miss. They'd been tracking me since I'd moved to Millbrook, learning my routines, my habits, my connections in the community. The smoke that Mrs. Henderson had seen, it was a signal, a panic signal. Someone had blown their cover, and they were preparing to eliminate the threat. The question that kept me awake at night was simple. Who had blown their cover? Who had discovered their operation and forced them to activate their contingency plan? The answer came from an unexpected source. Ordaos, a 12-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez. Emma was the kind of kid who noticed everything. Bright, curious, always asking questions that adults found uncomfortable. She'd been riding her bike past the Blackwood house for weeks, and she'd noticed something that everyone else had missed. The cars behind the house changed positions every few days. Not just parked in different spots, completely different cars. Someone was coming and going regularly, and they were being very careful about it. More importantly, Emma had seen something the night before Mrs. Henderson spotted the smoke. She'd been coming home late from a friend's house when she saw a man leaving the Blackwood house. But it wasn't just any man. It was someone she recognized. Someone everyone in town knew and trusted. Mayor Richard Crenshaw, the man who'd been running Millbrook for 12 years. The man who'd made it his mission to attract new businesses and new residents to our struggling town. The man who'd personally welcomed me to the community and made sure I felt at home. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Crenshaw wasn't just the mayor he was the inside man. He had access to all the information the trafficking ring needed. Property records, resident databases, demographic information. He knew who was vulnerable, who was isolated, who wouldn't be missed. And he'd been feeding that information to his partners for over a decade. But something had gone wrong. Our investigation revealed that Crenshaw had been trying to back out of the operation. The FBI's psychological profile suggested he'd grown uncomfortable with the escalating violence and had threatened to expose the entire ring. His partners had given him an ultimatum: eliminate the potential threats in Millbrook, starting with me, or they'd eliminate him. The smoke signal was his way of saying he couldn't go through with it. He'd rather expose himself than murder innocent people. In a twisted way, Richard Crenshaw had saved my life by refusing to take it. The arrest came on a cold November morning. We'd been tracking the movements of the trafficking ring for weeks, and we finally had enough evidence to move. The coordinated raids across 4 states resulted in the arrest of 37 people and the rescue of over 100 victims. It was the largest human trafficking bust in FBI history. But the story doesn't end there. As we processed the evidence, we discovered that Millbrook wasn't their first target. It was supposed to be their last. They'd been planning to shut down the operation after cleaning up loose ends in our town. If we hadn't uncovered their conspiracy when we did, dozens of people would have simply vanished, and no one would have known why. The psychological impact on our community was devastating. People who'd lived in Millbrook their entire lives suddenly realized they'd been living under surveillance for years. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion. The trust that makes small-town life possible had been shattered. But here's what I learned about human resilience during those dark months that followed. Communities can heal. People can rebuild trust. And sometimes, the very thing that threatens to destroy us can make us stronger. Emma Rodriguez, the 12-year-old girl whose observations had cracked the case wide open, became something of a local hero. Her curiosity and attention to detail had literally saved lives. The town council established a Citizens Watch program, teaching residents how to recognize suspicious activity and report it properly. We turned our vulnerability into vigilance. Mrs. Henderson, who'd first spotted the smoke signal, became the coordinator of a neighborhood network that checked on elderly and isolated residents daily. What had started as a community's greatest weakness, people living alone without strong connections, became its greatest strength as we built systems to ensure no one was truly alone. As for me, I realized that retirement didn't mean the end of my usefulness. The experience and instincts I'd developed over 30 years of police work weren't just personal assets, they were community resources. I started teaching classes at the local community center, sharing what I'd learned about personal safety and crime prevention. The Blackwood house stood empty for another year while legal proceedings dragged on. Eventually, the town purchased it through asset forfeiture and converted it into a community center. There's a certain poetic justice in transforming a place that was used to plan harm into a place where people gathered to help each other. Mayor Crenshaw received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation. He testified against his former partners and provided crucial information that led to the rescue of additional victims. I visited him in prison once, about 6 months after his sentencing. He looked older, broken, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before: peace. The peace that comes from finally telling the truth. He told me something that day that I'll never forget. He said, "Frank, I spent 12 years lying to good people, and I convinced myself I was doing it for the right reasons. I told myself I was bringing prosperity to the town, creating opportunities, building a better future. But the truth is, I was just scared. Scared of what would happen if I said no. Scared of losing everything I'd built. Scared of facing the consequences of my choices." He paused, looking out the small window of the visiting room, and then he said, "The funny thing is, I lost everything anyway, but for the first time in 12 years, I can sleep at night. That's worth something, isn't it?" I think about that conversation often, especially when I'm tempted to take shortcuts or avoid difficult truths. The case taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it whispers in your ear, promising easy solutions and comfortable compromises. It tells you that good people will be hurt if you don't cooperate, that the greater good requires moral flexibility, that you can always make things right later. But there is no later. There are only the choices we make today, in this moment, when no one is watching and no one will know the difference except us. Character isn't what we do when the stakes are high and everyone's attention is focused on us. Character is what we do in the quiet moments when we think no one will ever find out. The trafficking ring operated for over a decade because good people made small compromises. They noticed things that didn't quite add up, but decided it wasn't their business. They had suspicions, but chose not to voice them. They saw opportunities to help, but convinced themselves someone else would handle it. I'm not judging them. I understand the impulse to mind your own business, to avoid conflict, to trust that someone else in authority is handling the big problems. But this case taught me that democracy, community, and basic human decency depend on ordinary people being willing to pay attention, ask questions, and take action when something doesn't feel right. Today, Millbrook is a different place. We're more connected, more aware, more engaged with each other's lives. We've learned that the price of safety isn't just eternal vigilance. It's eternal involvement. We have to care about each other, check on each other, and be willing to have difficult conversations when we notice something amiss. The case also taught me something about the nature of justice. We caught the bad guys, rescued the victims, and restored order to our community. But true justice isn't just about punishment and consequences. It's about healing, rebuilding, and creating systems that prevent similar crimes from happening again. As I sit here today, 5 years after that October morning when Mrs. Henderson came running across the street, I realized that solving this case wasn't just about applying the investigative skills I'd learned over 30 years of police work. It was about understanding that retirement doesn't mean withdrawal from community responsibility. It means applying a lifetime of experience to serve others in new ways. The young detective who started walking beats in Detroit 40 years ago thought justice was about catching criminals and putting them in prison. The retired detective who solved the Millbrook conspiracy knows that justice is about building communities where crimes like this can't take root in the first place. Every morning, I still sit on my porch with my coffee, watching the town wake up. But now, I'm not just enjoying the peace and quiet. I'm paying attention. I'm part of a network of neighbors who care about each other's well-being. I'm using everything I've learned to help ensure that what happened here never happens again. That's the real lesson of the Blackwood House case. Sometimes the most important mysteries aren't the ones we solve, they're the ones we prevent. And sometimes the most valuable thing a retired detective can do isn't look backward at old cases, but look forward to the community we're building together. The badge may be retired, but the commitment to justice never is.